It's part of the hustle of the hustle is letting people share in what you're doing and creating. What was the decision to start the podcast? What's the podcast name?
It's called The Perfectly Preserved Podcast. And it actually was my podcast partner, Jenny. She's a great friend of mine in Northern California. And I actually invited her to come out to Utah and take the Master Food Preserver course here because her area was not she tried a couple times at a local extension office and they weren't very friendly and they weren't very great. And I didn't really know her that well. You're probably sensing a pattern here. I'm just like, come on out, come to Utah. Right, yeah. You can stay in my Airbnb and I'll take you around. We'll do the course. It'll be great. And she's just as passionate as I am about food preserving. And so, we decided to start this podcast and we just talk for the podcast. Yeah, we aim for like 20 to 30 minutes. Bite-sized podcast pieces where we dive into all aspects of preserving. So not just canning, but preserving as well.
For specific episodes that you guys like ideas, how do you guys come up with it? Do you guys brainstorm together and say, okay, here's like, how much structure do you guys actually have with putting these episodes together?
We have a running Google Doc where we type in questions that people have given us over social media, or they'll send it into the email. Sometimes we'll just do like troubleshooting questions or FAQ questions that are in the back of our canning books that people might not know. What about you? Like, do you have an idea for your podcast episodes months in advance, or is it kind of...
At some point, I would have to get a little more organized that way. I have because I do Tossing Salad podcast on my own, the running list is in my head. I'm a very random, in the moment creator. Like in my head, I have so many ideas, but I am so scatterbrained. Knowing what I want to do and talk about, it's hard for me to be organized long term, but for the week, I kind of operate on a weekly basis for the podcast because I'll come up with an idea, I'll be like, that's the idea I want to run with. Yeah. And then I dive right in, and that's where I decide, okay, this is going to be all the short form content. This is what I'm going to talk about on the podcast. The idea for this series, where I'm talking to 4 different people about their hustles, came about watching somebody else's story and them basically sitting there and telling people, honestly, I'm struggling with the ups and downs of being self-employed and trying to move away from that traditional 9-to-5 job and take a chance on myself and create this business that's my passion, but I want to see if I can make a living out of it. Yeah. And I saw that story that she had posted just saying some days I'm on a high, and then some days I made the biggest mistake in my life.
Yeah. Having a small business is super hard. You start with like a passion and you're like, oh, this is a great idea. And then you have to learn things, QuickBooks and sheets and accounting and things that are not glamorous, not fun. And I personally, I don't know about you, Brian, but I don't have a business background. And so I'm always having to Google things or ask other small business owners, like, what are you doing for this? Or what accountant do you use? And it just makes my head swim. It's like the worst.
Is that the part though that makes you feel like, yeah, this isn't worth it? The business side of these hustles and passions?
I don't know. I mean, I just look at it as a problem that I have to solve again.
Well, like, let's say if we're talking the podcast, people are like, oh, all you have to do is turn on the microphone. If you have a video podcast, you got the video, just record what you're doing. But the problem is there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you have to consider that's on the business side of things with just a podcast. Like you said that you enjoy editing and everything like that. I don't know if you edit your podcasts or what you do there.
No, we have an editor and it's expensive.
So there's cost associated with this.
Absolutely. Venture. So then it's like, oh, do we need to monetize the podcast? Because like both of us are paying a certain amount each month and like, it's not a small chunk of change. Like, how do we monetize? How do we get people to pay for episodes? I don't know. Are you to that point, Brian, like in either of your podcasts?
Daily, I have the struggle of sustainability. Can I sustain what I'm doing and
Mm,
still, one, enjoy it, and two, how much time of mine
yeah.
is going to have to be devoted to putting stuff out, whether it's on Tossing Salad Podcast, whether it's on my other podcast that I do with my buddy Greg, which is Iller and Filthier.
Hmm.
There's a lot of time, not
Yeah.
much less the money. There's a money cost association with that, but there's also time. And so I pretty much do it all just because I don't have the money to invest. And if I want the podcast to go on, I have to find ways to either learn how to edit and edit better, or
Hmm.
find ways to monetize where I can sustain doing that in addition to all the other things that I do. Like right
So
now
how
for your
much?
podcast, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, I was gonna say like in my mind, I'm thinking like, is it like 3 to 4 hours to edit a video, or like how long does it take to edit your podcast videos?
It all depends on how much of what I envision and I want out of it, how much time do I want to spend to do it. It could take as little as 30 minutes to an hour if I want to just throw on one window and very basic edits, like throw in some music, a beginning and an end. Or do I want to have it to where the video switches between the two of us and I go in and I edit out the and the pops and all the things that kind of annoy me personally? It could take 5 hours.
Wow.
And so that's where you're like, and I think what you said is you're paying somebody to edit your podcast.
Yeah, Jenny and I both were like, okay, like, do we have the bandwidth or the time or the background, educational knowledge to do it? And we both were like, no, no.
But it
But
takes away
then
from creating other things.
it does. But every month I have to figure out, okay, like, how am I going to pay for my podcast edit? It's not like a crazy amount. It's like $200 a month, but it's just like an additional bill. And I'm just like, how am I gonna work this out?
So
Uh,
I have to imagine you and Jenny have had the conversation of, okay, well, can we monetize this to the point to where
mhm.
we can sustain the podcast? And because
Yeah,
at some point, is doing the podcast worth spending, what'd you say,
sure.
200 a month?
Yeah, 2,400 a year.
It, it,
I
that has to
know.
come from somewhere.
I know. So this is what we did in January, and I want to say a little bit of last year is that we sent out tons of emails to companies that were associated with food preserving, right? So Ball Canning and Presto and Redmond Real Salt and all kinds of things. And we're getting a decent amount of downloads every week. And
Hmm.
so luckily that data is there, and I think eventually people will come around. Do you step out of your lane and find different supporters for our podcast that don't have to do with food preserving? I'm sure plenty of people do that, and it's fine. It's just like we wanted to start there and it kind of crickets. So I don't
Yeah, I
know.
guess you can have either your listeners kind of tip or pay for the podcast a little bit to help you offset that,
Yeah.
or you can, I guess, monetize to the point on certain platforms, like by views or listens. You get paid by that
Mhm.
platform,
Yeah.
and then kind of, I think what you were mentioning a little bit with like potential sponsorships. There could be companies that'll
Right.
come in and sponsor the show or the episode and help you offset some of those costs. But the costs are real. And
Yeah.
that's one of those things to where I know I can't put forth a fraction of what you guys pay for your podcast. And I can't imagine if do you guys have an audio or a
Right.
video podcast?
So we just have audio. Unfortunately, Jenny lives in an area with terrible service. She lives kind of in the boonies in Northern California. And so even when we do our audio podcast, she has to turn on low data mode on her side. So yeah, it's not the best.